This is Luke chapter 17, starting in verse 11. As Jesus continued on toward Jerusalem, he reached the border between Galilee and Samaria. As he entered a village there, 10 lepers stood at a distance, crying out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." He looked at them and said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." As they went, they were cleansed of their leprosy. One of them, when he saw that he was healed, came back to Jesus shouting, "Praise God." He fell to the ground at Jesus' feet, thanking him for what he had done. This man was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Didn't I heal 10 men? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give glory to God except this foreigner?" And Jesus said to the man, "Stand up and go. Your faith has healed you." So we're in our third week of a series that we've entitled Individualism. What we're doing is we're talking about the way that American culture's emphasis on or elevation of the individual, which in some ways is a good thing, can also be a distorting thing. That when we're encouraged to approach faith, church, Jesus, with this sort of rugged individualistic mentality, that it can misshape us. What it means to be human for the Christian person is anchored in what we believe to be the nature of God. So in the same way that God exists as a relationship between three distinguishable but inseparable persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So God is a relationship between three distinguishable but inseparable persons. What it means to be human, made in God's image, is that we are distinguishable from one another, but inseparable from one another. So the other way to say that is that we become our truest selves only in right relationship with one another. There's no way to separate you as the individual person from other people. We become our truest selves in relationship with each other. So what we're doing is we're talking about practices that the Christian faith offers that sort of push against this rugged, individualistic way of thinking about life and faith, and sort of pulling us back into a more corporate existence. This morning, what I want to talk to you about is the sacrament of communion, the practice of communion. So in our story, Jesus is traveling from the northern region of Galilee. He's traveling south toward the city of Jerusalem. He reaches the border between Galilee and Samaria, and he encounters a leper colony, 10 lepers. And they're in sort of a desperate situation, and so they cry out to Jesus, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Jesus tells them to go show themselves to the priests. They do that, and they're healed. And if the story just ended right there, this would just be a nice little contained healing story, right? You got 10 guys, they're down on their luck. They have this serendipitous encounter with Jesus, and he heals them. Nice. But the story doesn't end there. The majority of the story goes on. This isn't just a healing story. One of these lepers comes back to thank Jesus for the healing that he received. Okay, that's cool. But instead of Jesus just saying, "You're welcome," he makes a big deal about the fact that the other 9 guys don't come back. Right? Didn't I heal 10 guys? Where are the other 9? What's the big deal? I mean, why is this such a big deal to Jesus that these other 9 guys don't return? I mean, is it just that, Jesus gets a little frustrated when he does something nice for you and you don't say thank you? I mean, is that what we're supposed to take from the story? That, hey, don't be like the 90% of people who God does nice stuff from and you're ungrateful. There's something more going on here. At the end of Jesus' encounter with our lone returnee, Jesus says to him, "Stand up and go. Your faith has healed you." This guy had already been healed. He'd already been healed of his leprosy. But when he comes back, Jesus says, stand up and go, your faith has healed you. See, there's a deeper kind of healing that's going on in this guy who returned. Actually, the words they're different. So the words for healing and cleansed earlier in the story are different. This word that Jesus uses at the end, it's not the same word. It actually means has made you well or has saved you. So it's a deeper kind of healing that goes on in the one guy who returns that I think Jesus wanted for all 10. All 10 men experienced the healing of their leprosy. Only one guy was saved in a deeper and more fundamental way. A kind of saving that Jesus wanted for all of them. So the question is, what kind of saving happened? What happened in the life of this one guy that apparently didn't happen in the lives of the other 9? Well, the context clues in the story suggest to me that this was a mixed leper colony. It's a border area between predominantly Jewish and Samaritan regions. We know this one person is a Samaritan who returns. Luke and Jesus both kind of make a point of that. So at least I think some of the other 10 lepers were Jews. Now, if you're new to church, if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, Jews and Samaritans did not often associate with one another. It's a long story. It was a religious feud. They both claimed to worship the same God, but each group sort of thought of its worship as being better or purer or more correct. And so they tended to look down on one another. It's nice that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore, right? But their feud, this religious conflict, could at times become violent. So they didn't associate with one another. And yet Jesus finds 10 men, some of whom are Jews, some of whom are Samaritans, and they're together. Well, how is it that these Jews and Samaritans are willing to associate with one another when Jews and Samaritans didn't typically associate with one another? I mean, it should be obvious, right? They had leprosy. Now, again, if you're new to church, if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, in their respective faith traditions, leprosy is a word that's used to refer to a number of different infectious skin diseases. What's important to note is that if you contracted an infectious skin disease, you were considered unfit to worship. And your worshiping community expelled you, at least until you were healed. Unless, of course, your condition couldn't be healed, and in that case, your expulsion was permanent. So, under normal circumstances, Jews and Samaritans would shun each other. But if either contracted an infectious skin disease, they were shunned by their own. So if you're a leper, the only people that you can hang out with are other lepers. And then when you're in that kind of a desperate situation, where literally the alternative is that you are entirely alone, the fact that you disagree with that guy over where true worship happens seems a little less relevant. See, these guys are willing to associate with one another where Jews and Samaritans normally wouldn't, because they'd been expelled from their respective communities. But then something happens. They all get healed. So the one thing that made it reasonable, possible for them to associate with one another is gone. And what do? Well, 9 of the 10, Jesus tells all 10, go see the priests. Again, if you're new to church, unfamiliar with the Bible, in their respective faith traditions, if you contracted an infectious skin disease and you got expelled from the community, the only way you got reinstated was if you went to the priest and the priest gave you a clean bill of health. So the priest would examine you, the priest would determine, okay, I think you're actually healed, come on back in. The priest was the gatekeeper of the worshiping community. So Jesus tells all 10 of these lepers, go show yourselves to the priests. This is how you get back into the communities who taught you about God in such a way that made it possible for you to hate one another. Go show yourselves to the priests. 9 of the 10, I presume, do exactly that. They go show themselves to the priests, they get their clean bill of health, and they return to the respective segregated communities that made it possible for them to hate one another before they got leprosy. But not our one returnee. The one guy who comes back, he didn't go to the priest. The story says that as they went, they were healed. As they went, they were healed. Jesus says, go show yourselves to the priest. They say, okay, I don't know, they're in a desperate situation, whatever. Jesus tells us to do something, we're going to do it. They're on their way to the priest, and they realize they're healed. I don't know what that looked like or how that happened, but they're on their way to the priest. They look down at their infected areas, and they realize, it's gone. I'm better. At that moment, 9 of the 10 keep going. They go to the priest, they get their clean bill of health, and back to their homes. This guy stops, turns around. When he saw that he was healed, he goes back to Jesus. And both Jesus and Luke make a big deal about the fact that he is a Samaritan. See, a moment ago, as a Samaritan, Jesus is a Jew. So normally, Jews and Samaritans don't associate with one another. A minute ago, this Samaritan was just desperate. So he calls out to Jesus for mercy. Yeah, he's a Jew, but he's a Jew who can help you. So what's the big deal? Right? You got nothing to lose. But see, now, he's got no good reason to go back. His leprosy is cured. He doesn't need Jesus anymore, not for this purpose. He could just as easily go see the priest and go back home. Go back to the community that taught him to think about God in a way that made it impossible to hate Jews in the first place. But instead, he stops and he goes back. I think because he had eyes of faith to see something that the other 9 guys missed. That in his encounter with Jesus, he saw something. He realized something that the other 9 guys didn't see. And it saved him. It saved him. Fundamentally saved him. It's not hard to understand. You just have to allow your experience in life to actually influence what you think. He's hanging out with 9 other people, some of whom he's been taught his whole life to hate. They call on Jesus for mercy, and as they're going to see the priests, they're healed. He experiences a miraculous healing from God, but so did they. So he realizes, I was healed, but so are you. And just a minute ago, my assumption was, God was against you and for me. And your assumption was that God was against me and for you. But God just healed us both. You don't have to have an advanced degree in theology to figure this out. This guy had eyes of faith to see that if God heals both Jew and Samaritan, then God must love both Jew and Samaritan with equal love. He doesn't love the Jew more or the Samaritan more because the one's worship is purer or more correct, or they've got better answers, or they worship in the right place, or whatever. This guy realized something. His understanding of God was challenged by his experience with Jesus, and he let it be challenged. He realized in that moment, God is merciful to all, because God doesn't just show mercy, God is mercy. This is who God is. And it begins to radically reorient then how he's going to live his life. Because once you realize that God is not someone who's for me and against them, and you're made in God's image, it's just an easy hop, skip, and a jump to realizing you can't be against them either. That if God is mercy, then your posture has to be mercy. See, how you think about God changes how you relate and see and relate to people. So their fundamental problem wasn't leprosy. Leprosy was a problem, but it wasn't the biggest problem. At least not according to Jesus. They all get healed from their leprosy, but only one guy gets saved. Only one guy has his real problem dealt with. Our biggest problem as human beings is the way that we think about God. You have heard me say this. If you've been here, you've heard me say this countless times. The most important thing about you is what you think about when you think about God. The fundamental human problem is believing things about God that are not true, that lead us to then see people in ways that are not true, and to then demonize and hate and even do violence against people. I mean, guys, that is the story. That is the story that this book tells. In the first 11 chapters of this book, it's laying out for you the basic human problem. Human beings are made in the image of God. God is a life giver. God has life in God's self. All God does is make stuff. He gives life. He produces life, creates life. Human beings are made in God's image. Human beings are supposed to be life givers. We're literally supposed to take the stuff that God makes and make stuff with it. Right? Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, tend to it, cultivate. Human beings are supposed to be essentially life-giving creatures. But you don't get through chapter 3. In my Bible, that's 2.5 pages. You don't get through chapter 3 before the human beings who were created to be life-giving creatures start believing things about God that are not true. And then within one chapter, the creatures who are supposed to be life givers become life takers. You get your first human-on-human act of violence. Cain murders Abel. And then it is like within a blink of an eye, we go from God is nothing but life, giver of life, creator of life. Human beings are supposed to be givers and creators of life. We believe lies about God. Someone kills somebody. And then Cain's worried that someone's going to kill him. And then before you get through chapter 4, you've got some guy named Lamech talking about if anybody harms me, I'm going to repay them 70 times, 7 times vengeance. I mean, we've literally gone from you're supposed to be life givers to unlimited retaliation in 4 chapters. By the time you get to chapter 6, the story says that God looked at the world and he saw that it was full of violence. Violence. the fundamental human problem is that we believe things about God that are not true. It causes us to believe things about one another that are not true and to do harm to one another. We're supposed to be life givers and we become life takers. That is the problem that beginning in chapter 12, God sets out to remedy. And the way that he does that is first and foremost through the person of Jesus Christ. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In our encounter with God through Christ, at just the right time, God comes to be with us, takes on flesh, moves into the neighborhood, shows up. If you see me, you've seen the Father. This is what God is like. So you don't have to be trapped in your lies about God's nature anymore. You can look at Jesus. God is like Jesus. When we look at the God who's revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, what do we see? We see a God who doesn't just show mercy, he is mercy. See, a God who can save us but doesn't want to is no good. A God who wants to save us but can't, no good. The good news is that the God revealed in the person of Jesus Christ proclaims himself to be both willing and able. That's what this Samaritan realized in his encounter with Jesus, is that it wasn't like he didn't believe God was merciful. It was that his imagination was not stretched big enough. It did not occur to him just how merciful God could be. The way that God solves our imagination problem, the way that we think about God, is he comes to be with us in the person of Jesus Christ. But then he gives us a group, a body, a community. See, what helped this guy reimagine God was his engagement with other people. People who, in another context, he would have been against. But by watching God be merciful to him, I have to reimagine what God is actually like. It's in his relationship to other people that has an impact, that changes him. See, when you approach faith, life, Jesus in this sort of rugged, individualistic way, it's possible to gain some benefit, right? It's possible to experience some healing. All of these lepers are healed from their leprosy. But to miss the fundamental saving that Jesus is actually interested in. To change the way that we think about God, and then also to change the way that we see one another and the way that we interact with one another. And so what God gives us is a corporate experience, a group to be a part of, where when we come together, see, most of what we do at church, you can do by yourself. And quite frankly, you can do it better. I mean, I like to think I'm a decent speaker, but you can download any number of podcasts and listen to people that can speak circles around me. You know, our band's not bad. They're not Hillsong. I mean, if you want like blow you the doors off worship music, you can get that in your car stereo. But you know what you can't do by yourself? You can't do communion by yourself. Gathering, right? The gathering of the church, embodied in the sacrament of communion. See, when Jesus says, "This is my body, broken, given for you," the you is plural. It's to you people. It's to the group. When you come to the communion table, you come as people who are different. I mean, you may not realize how different you are. Your different genders, your different ethnicities. You're rich and poor. You're educated and uneducated. You're Republican and Democrat. You're people, you don't share the same theological beliefs. You don't share the same political beliefs. You don't share the same moral beliefs. And in any other context, it's possible for you to be so dangerously different that it's easy for you to alienate or to demonize the other. But the church is an alternative community. It's a different place. See, this guy's he knows what going to see the priest means. Going to see the priest means I'm going right back to the community that raised me to hate people. And I'm not doing that anymore because that's not how I understand God. So I'm not going to go back to that same old community. I'm going to go start a new one. Even if I'm the only person there to begin with. But this is going to be a community that now orbits around a different understanding of God and a different way of relating to one another. That when we come forward and we take the bread, right? When Jesus said, "This is my body given for you," it's given for you and him. This is my blood shed for you and her. See, communion is the place where we have to stretch our imagination of how big God's mercy is. How big must God's mercy be if God is willing to break his own body and shed his own blood for everyone? And it also stretches your understanding and your imagination of your own mercy. If God is someone who breaks his own body and sheds his own blood for you and him, for you and her, for us and them, then what does our posture have to be toward other people? See, one of the ways that God saves the world is through the church. And I don't mean that triumphalistically. I mean, this is a place where you learn. You learn what God is like, and you can begin to live what God is like. First and foremost in here, but also out there. See, we gather kind of like lepers. We share a condition that is way bigger and way more complicated. The roots are far deeper than we understand, and we do not have the capacity to get at it directly ourselves. And so what do? We call on the mercy of Jesus. Because I need to know. I need to know that at the end of the day, I belong to somebody. Right? Because my problems are too big, my sin's too big, I can't do it myself. It's complicated. We're working on it. And so in the process, you got to know that you belong to somebody. You belong to God. It's God's mercy that you can always call on. We commit ourselves to doing what he says, even when it doesn't make any sense, because we trust him. And in the process, you experience healing. Healing not just for yourself, but you also experience the healing that happens in other people's lives. That I'm not outside of God's grace, and neither is he, neither is she. That in a world where it's perfectly acceptable and even encouraged to demonize and hate other people and justify violence against them, the church is a place where we come together as people who are different, but we become a family of siblings who the differences are still there. But now we're orbiting around a particular God, committed to a particular way of seeing life and seeing each other and living. And that kind of faith, that's saving faith. That's a faith that saves you, fundamentally saves you, and has the power to save the world.